Do-do-dee. It's Nandi!
Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns faction, is one of the most iconic and plot-centric figures of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Once one of the greatest psykers known to the Imperium of Man, Magnus's flirtation with the powers of the Warp eventually brought about his own damnation and servitude to the Chaos God Tzeentch. Magnus's role in the Horus Heresy and fall of Prospero is well documented, and now the iconic character comes to Tacticus as the newest raid boss. In this video I'll showcase the new boss, breaking down his gameplay and abilities, and then show you how to craft teams and strategies to succeed. Without further ado. Hello, sorry, just a quick add-on. Between creating this video initially and it going live, I've hit 13,000 subscribers, so here's a code. Enjoy. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do, because more subscribers equals more codes. Back to the regular programming. Magnus has many traits and unique abilities like all of the other raid bosses. We've seen all of these traits before. Magnus has the Immune, Weaver of Fates, Big Target, Daemon, Flying, and Psyker traits. Many of these traits are expected of bosses, but I wanted to highlight the Daemon and Psyker traits in particular because these will have implications for which characters we can bring to do well against him. Magnus has 3 active and 3 passive abilities, shown on screen. I'll go into this in more depth during the gameplay section. Magnus has a 7 hex profile and a base movement of 5, which, combined with his flying ability, makes him pretty hard to pin down. Tawin, Tacticus ambassador and friend, has plotted Magnus against the other bosses. We've used Legendary 5 as a baseline example. Magnus's armor at Legendary 5 is on the lower end of the spectrum when compared to other bosses, sitting at 1715. However, Magnus's armor cannot be reduced by killing the side bosses. This graph compares Magnus's armor to other bosses pre and post side boss kills. Magnus also has Terminators and Rubric Marines fighting alongside him, and the exact number will depend on the rarity of the fight. Magnus's first active ability is called Blade of Magnus. This deals psychic damage to a target within 2 hexes and all adjacent enemies. This ability also does bonus damage if the targets are on fire hexes. Magnus's second active ability is called Treason of Tzeentch. This teleports an enemy character to another random hex and creates a copy at the old location. This copy fights on Magnus's team against your characters. Magnus's final active ability is Tzeentch's Firestorm. This forms a ring precisely 2 hexes away. All units on the marked hexes take fire damage at the start of Magnus's next turn. The process repeats for the next 2 turns, with the ring reducing in size and increasing in hits. The first and probably the most important of Magnus's passive abilities is Gaze of Magnus. This ability marks a unit at the end of Magnus's turns. If that unit is a Psyker or attacks Magnus, it takes damage. Additionally, if it's a Psyker, it is also stunned. This ability increases in damage depending on how many consecutive turns Magnus has fixed his gaze on the target. The next passive is Psychic Dominion. This lets Magnus take 66% less psychic damage and also lets him deal 66% more damage to Psyker units. His final passive is Impossible Form. Every turn, on every 9th attack, Magnus takes 90% less damage. This works for the 9th attack, 18th attack, and so on. What separates Magnus from other bosses is that usage of his active abilities seems more random. You can still get the same response from the same opening positions, but his code is a lot more nuanced, so he will seemingly randomly change behavior between runs. Gone will be the days of being able to follow a guildmate's replay blindly, and instead you'll be forced to use some flexible and critical thinking to succeed. However, as a result, I think the boss will be more enjoyable for longer, especially compared to bosses like Screamer Killer, where the fight becomes straightforward and trivial after enough time. There is, however, one bit of AI nuance that I have observed in testing. Magnus appears to have an essential targeting priority for his passive ability, Gaze of Magnus. Initially, this seems to prefer targeting Psykers over all other units. However, if there are no Psykers, Magnus's gaze appears to turn to the unit that has dealt the most damage to him so far during the entire battle. When you think about it, it's a pretty cool mechanic. This massive Daemon Primarch hates Psykers, but if there are none around, he'll turn and angrily stare at the puny insect that dared to attack him. I love the flavour. For example, Ragnar does a massive hit with Warhowl plus some bonuses. Afterwards, as you can see here, Magnus turns his gaze on him. Remember that if your unit is not a Psyker, simply don't attack Magnus with it for one turn. This means that your unit won't take additional damage from his gaze and is particularly useful if your roster is underdeveloped and won't be able to survive multiple hits. Regular channel viewers will be broadly familiar with this slide, which highlights the game's 3 core guild raid teams. We can talk about each and analyse which might be best. The Psyker team is probably the easiest to discount because of Magnus's trait, Psychic Dominion. Given that the Thousand Suns aren't usable against Magnus, this team would have struggled anyway. The mech team is an interesting proposition. The bulk of the damage from the team comes from Exeter Rowe, the Skitarii Rustwalker. As you saw earlier, Magnus tends to turn his gaze towards the target that does the most damage to him, and as a result, your biggest damage dealer, Rowe, will get destroyed pretty quickly. Magnus also brings a load of summons to the battlefield, flies around the map, and sometimes teleports your units away from an optimal position. Combining these factors can make the mechanical team, which relies on fixed positioning, less ideal. So, where does that leave us? Basically, back with Old Faithful, the multi-hit team. I know what you're thinking. Hold on a second, Nandi. Didn't you just say that Magnus will kill Psykers, and Eldryon is the linchpin for the multi-hit team? Yes, you're right, but thankfully, there is a new hero on the block. I believe Helbrecht will be the most crucial hero against this boss. His passive ability, Destroy the Witch, gives him and adjacent melee units almost 1500 bonus damage per melee hit against Psykers. Essentially, you want to use Helbrecht with a melee multi-hit composition. Ragnar and Karn both have a high number of hits that complement Helbrecht well, and I enjoy both for different reasons. If you're familiar with the lore, you'll know that the Space Wolves fought the Thousand Suns on Prospero at the crux of the Horus Heresy. It is therefore beautifully poetic to see a son of Russ leading the charge against Magnus himself. And Karn? Well, it's great that he doesn't care who he attacks, even if it's another servant of chaos, albeit a different god to Khorne. The last few slots are flexible. Asmodai and Roswitha potentially have a role as they cause increased damage to daemons and psykers through their abilities. Onshi can double charge Ragnar's Warhowl for a big burst of damage, and Calgar is simply another excellent buffer who can also help clear some adds with his active ability. Ernst, Tacticus ambassador and friend, has also thrown another spicy meatball into the mix, Tiark. If we can find a way to let Ragnar kill one of the cloned units, then Tiark benefits from Ragnar's passive. Tiark also does loads of extra damage against Psykers, and giving him a bonus of 3 hits, plus further bonus damage from Helbrecht, could make him a reasonable choice. As you can see in this clip, when Ragnar kills a summoned clone, the Saga of the Warrior-born passive is conferred to his fellow Space Wolves. There are 2 side bosses to go over very briefly. As has been the trend for a while, the side bosses tend to mirror the playable version of the character, but have an extra ability to make them more unique. For Thaumachus, this ability is called Illusions of Tzeentch. At the start of the battle, this passive creates a copy of all of the units you have brought to the fight. These copies have the same stats and ability levels as your team. Killing these copies does a big chunk of damage to Thaumachus. If you try and damage Thaumachus without killing the copies, you will suffer a 66% damage penalty. Talon has again done some math, and it looks like killing the copies does between 4 and 4.5% of Thaumacis' health in damage, depending on the rarity level at Legendary. The other side boss is Abraxas. The core mechanic is Screamer Invocation here. This behaves a little bit like the Sibyl and Corodius fights. Abraxas starts the fight with a bunch of pink horrors. Once these are defeated, he then spawns a wave of Screamers. Defeating a Screamer damages Abraxas. While there are daemons of any sort alive, whether it's pink horrors or Screamers, Abraxas takes 66% less damage. Killing the side bosses nets you the bonuses as shown on screen here. Feel free to pause or take notes if you'd like. Okay, that's been a longer video, so I'll maybe sign off there. I've just started a Patreon for my channel. If you are fortunate enough to be in a position to support me and my content, I'd love if you could check it out. I'm really grateful to the small group that have already done so and given me a platform to continue creating content. If not, I've left my refer a friend code here on screen. If you are a newer player, you can enter it and earn yourself 100 Blackstone. It is single use though, so choose who you support carefully. Bye for now.
Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi.